Hey, good day, my beautiful children. That's for you, Billy. Well, that's for all you guys. Um, it's Monday, May 4th, and we're continuing our discussion on the Cold War. This will be our last day talking about the Cold War in general terms. Tomorrow, we're going to hit, and then the rest of the week, we're going to hit Vietnam, which is really some interesting stuff. We're going back to our discussion of what the Cold War was like and how it impacted people here in the United States. And if it was happening here, you could essentially boy, it's really dark. Hold on a minute. There. Now you can see my beautiful face. Anyway, if it was happening here in the United States, the same thing was happening in the Soviet Union and other places in the world. Um, just we tend to think that oh, everything's different between us and Russia. No, Russians are people too, just because they're communist and whatever. Very similar, the same fears and feelings as Americans. So, um, anyway, like I said, I grew up at the tail end of the Cold War, but I still remember some of these things. And even though I didn't live with the daily fear of the Soviet Union and them lobbing nuclear weapons over at us, it still played a role. For example, if you ever want to know who the America's enemies are, or at least our perceived enemies, watch the action films of whatever decade, and that'll tell you. So, for example, in the movies of the '40s, all the bad guys were fascists or Nazis. In the '50s, '60s, and '70s, into the '80s, they were all communists, Russians, and especially Russians. Um, and all the movies of the '90s and today were terrorists, uh, and now it's kind of all over the place. But yeah, anyway, all the action films in my growing up when I was a kid, all the bad guys were always Russians. That's who Rambo was fighting. That's who the kids in Red Dawn, the original Red Dawn, were fighting. It was the Cubans and the and the Russians, and so they were still there. But when my parents were kids, and it would be your grandparents were kids, uh, there was a real fear about Russia, about the Soviet Union, and about nuclear Armageddon and war. And so, let me tell you why. Both sides practiced a policy called MAD, which is an anagram for mutually assured destruction. What's that mean? It means that both sides created and kept creating and building nuclear weapons with the idea that if they made enough of them and they made uh, ones that were powerful enough that neither side would ever be crazy enough to use them. I know what you're thinking, Mr. Hudak. That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. Yes, children, you're 100% right. We spent trillions of dollars, both sides, on nuclear arms programs with the idea that if we made them enough of them, we'd never have to use them. So, what's mutually assured destruction mean? In a nutshell, it means that um, if you launch yours, we launch ours, and we're both going to die. It's like a suicide pact almost. It's insane, but that's what it was. And another word for it is nuclear deterrence. Again, the idea that if we make enough nukes and they're big enough and powerful enough, and we have enough to destroy the world many times over, then no one's ever going to use them. If you want to see a really good movie and it's really funny about how ridiculous that whole premise is, there's a movie called Doctor Strangelove, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb, and it's all about mutually assured destruction and how stupid that is as an idea. But anyway, that's the fear that people grew up with. And so every presidential election during this time of the Cold War, that was the main topic. It was, yeah, the economy was there, but it was always about Russia, Russia, Russia. What are we going to do about the Soviets? What are we going to do about nukes? So the United States, at least, did a lot of things to try and calm people down. One of the things they did is they distributed pamphlets and made little cartoons and movies. I'm going to link one today to you, and it's hilarious. It's called Duck and Cover, and you see this little turtle guy here, Bert. He was he was basically the spokes animal for this whole thing. This picture here on the right, this was the reality. So like when my parents were in school, and they would have been these kids' age, um, they would have, like we have tornado drills and fire drills. they had duck and cover nuclear drills. The idea is you'd hide underneath your desk, you'd duck and cover up and put your hands behind your head, and that would save you from, a nuclear blast. No, of course it wouldn't. What would it do? It would make your last moments on Earth socially awkward. But that's, they did that to put people's fears at ease. They also created fallout shelters. The middle school I went to was an old building, and they still had the little yellow sign. You've probably seen these before. They're a yellow sign with a circle and three black triangles, and that's where you were supposed to go if there was a nuclear attack. That was supposed to keep you safe. Some people even went as far as to build their own nuclear bomb shelters, and they ranged from just little cellars that dug in your backyard to giant underground bunkers. And you guys have probably seen reality TV shows where they go to visit some of these, and it's insane. But that's what people did because the threat was very real, and people were very scared. Um, so it is what it is. It seems crazy to us, but that's how it was back in the 50s and 60s. By the 70s and 80s, not so much, but 50s and 60s, definitely. So I mentioned fallout shelters. This is exactly what I'm talking about. Some people, not many, but some had backyard fallout shelters where they would dig basically a root cellar or a second basement, and they would stock it with food and canned goods and water and stuff. Um, and then there were hearings, congressional hearings held on the dangers of radioactive fallout. This idea that even if you survived a nuclear blast, that there would be fallout afterwards, and what would the world be like, with radiation everywhere. And again, this was a fear that most people in the United States lived with during the first couple decades of the Cold War. Today, it seems ridiculous and crazy. Back then, it was a real fear. Um, there is a positive side to this, and that would be the space program. So another way that the United States and the Soviet Union competed was the race to get astronauts up in space, and both sides. And if you know any history, you probably know about this. But both sides stole scientists from the Nazis after World War II, and the Nazis were defeated. Both the Soviet Union and the United States went in, and they snatched up as many scientists and rocketeers from the Nazi, rocket program as they possibly could, and put them to work for their space program. And there was a race to see who would get into space first. Soviet Union won this race. In 1957, they launched the first satellite. It's called Sputnik, and it was very embarrassing to the United States that they beat us into space. Then they launched another rocket with a dog. You see this very happy dog. Can you imagine being a dog and being shot into space? Must have been very confusing. The U.S. We then ended up sending up unmanned rockets and satellites, and then eventually manned missions. We created the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA. You guys have all heard of NASA. And we spent billions and billions of dollars on our space program, and then other billions of dollars to improve math, science, and foreign language education in high schools to try and put us ahead of the Russians. Now, who ended up winning this thing in the long haul? And I would have to say, I guess, the United States, because to this day, we're the only nation to put a man on the moon. Which, again, I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but it's weird. I feel it's weird that given all the technology we have today, how has no one else done it? And my wife and I, we have this argument all the time. She says, why would anybody want to do it if we've already done it? What's the point? And my point is always, don't you think China and Russia would love to steal our bragging rights for being the only country to have done this? And I can't believe in 2020 no one's done it again since. And I don't think it was staged, by the way. Please don't think that I'm telling you the moon landing was staged. But it just seems odd to me that we kind of, no, everybody just gave up putting people on the moon after we did it first. But what the heck? What do I know? What do I know? All right, That's it for today. Very short. I am gonna link this duck and cover video. Watch it. Have a laugh at it, but try and remember what it was like for kids your age in the 50s and 60s to actually have this fear of nuclear Armageddon, and to try and be talked off the ledge and be calmed by a talking cartoon turtle. Crazy times. All right, that is it for today. We're going to pick back up tomorrow with Vietnam. Got some really interesting stuff to teach you guys about that. But until then, peace and love, and I will see you tomorrow.